As was tradition for the 20th century, opposing groups to the strike blamed it on America's rent-free boogeyman, communism. This was only a few years before Joseph McCarthy's Enemies Within speech and the height of the Second Red Scare, so for producers it was the perfect fear to exploit in the American people. It didn't matter that the CSU was the picture-perfect image of democratic unionism that actively resisted the ideals of most types of collectivism in general. In the eyes of union opposition, the American Federation of Labor, the parent federation of the CSU, was lumped in with communists like the Conference of Industrial Organizations. Although the CSU wanted to move on from the strike and continue working on addressing issues within the industry of Hollywood crafts, the IATSE wasn't about to let them do that. Remember, at this time, the IATSE was functionally not a union, since the major studios were paying off the IA heads in order to ensure that the IA wages were low and the workers didn't strike. They were, at this time, completely antithetical to what a union is supposed to be. As a result, the main issue that would outline the next stage of the conflict was seemingly quite simple. Which union is responsible for said erection? Due to the strike and overall confusion present in regards to the roles of each union, the AFL stepped in, appointing a board of 3 neutral union presidents: William Doherty, National Association of Letter Carriers, Felix Knight, Brotherhood of Railway Carmen, and William Birthright, International Union of Journeyman Barbers. These union heads had no connection to the industry and honestly were oblivious about anything involving the strike, meaning they were likely the most objective group the AFL could find. The issue was that the AFL essentially poured gas into a trash fire when they ruled in their decision that CSU carpenters would control trim and millwork duties while the IATSE would be in charge of the erection of sets. This was frustratingly vague. What does erection mean? Well, in terms of relevant dictionary definitions, we have 2. The first is to assemble or build something, and the second is to erect something that has already been built. The issue is that the CSU carpenters have been historically responsible for the first definition, while the IATSE grips have been responsible for the second definition. Due to this vague ruling, IATSE President Richard Walsh, this guy, demanded that the IATSE do all aspects of set erection, including the actual construction of the sets. There was just one tiny little issue. The IATSE does not have workers to undertake that work, so Richard Walsh just created a new type of worker, the set erector. This was completely unprecedented, as the acts of building and assembling sets had always been 2 separate jobs that had been the responsibility of 2 separate types of worker. And despite very well knowing that this work had for years been the responsibility of the CSU, the producers agreed to proceed with the brand new set erectors, willfully locking out the CSU carpenters, full well knowing that it was going to cause another major conflict. As could be expected, the carpenters weren't too happy about this, and in an attempt to correct the injustice, they reached out to the AFL for clarification on their original ruling. In August, the AFL released a clarification, clarifying that the word erection is construed to mean assemblage of such sets on stages or locations. It is to be clearly understood that the committee recognizes the jurisdiction over construction work on such sets as coming within the purview of the United Brotherhood of Carpenters and Joiners jurisdiction. A quick reminder that the United Brotherhood of Carpenters and Joiners was the parental body of the CSU. Despite, or I guess in spite of this clarification, Richard Walsh and the producers completely fucking ignored it and moved forward with their plans to oust the CSU carpenters and painters. September 23rd was declared D-Day. The name was a little dramatic. So if you're Roy Brewer and the producers, how do you get rid of a very sizable amount of a workforce quickly and efficiently? Their solution was to make the carpenters and painters work on sets that were already designated as hot. A hot set is a set designation for a set in which everything is already built, assembled, and positioned, completely set up for a shoot. Due to this, the CSU workers had to refuse to work, since they were not permitted to work on hot sets. They were then given their paychecks, and their positions were replaced by IA workers. Obviously, the picket lines went up, but with those picket lines came an unintended consequence for the CSU. Although they were locked out of their work, when they formed a picket line, that fact didn't really matter. In the eyes of the public, it became a strike. This time, the CSU was financially weakened from the previous strike, but had to strike in order to have any chance of survival. Over the next several months, protests continued, with rampant violence between the CSU and the police and mob. Hundreds were arrested and stood trial in mass groups of up to 40 people. Allegedly, in one instance, the judge was so obviously corrupt in his proceedings that the jury unanimously voted to acquit all the picketers. Things continued to worsen, and it wasn't like anyone that was trying to help the CSU was actually helpful. Here's how negotiations between the CSU, IATSE producers, and third parties would go. The third party would insist on arbitration. The CSU would agree to unilaterally accept the arbitrator's decision. The arbitrator would rule in favor of the CSU. The IATSE would ignore the arbitrator's decision. The producers would claim that although they agreed with the arbitration, they would not interfere since the matter was between unions. Rinse and repeat. From there, it became clear that if the CSU could not win this strike, they would be done as a union, and the violence increased as a result. In October of 1946, IATSE Local 683 went on strike in support of the CSU. This was a legitimate issue for Brewer and the IA, since Local 683 was responsible for a film laboratory that dealt with millions of unprinted negatives, which effectively halted the production of many movies. As a result, Brewer would attempt to take back the film laboratory by force, but 683 set up round-the-clock guards and rebuffed their attempts to enter. Eventually, the police would just violate the rights of many in the Technicolor Film Corp laboratory, arresting upwards of 200 workers and protesters and allowing the IA to reclaim the building. Those arrested were kept in inhumane conditions at local jails, with some being kept for up to 14 hours without food. Following these events, 2 studio officials were beaten outside of their houses by unidentified men. So there's this part of the story that I cannot confirm happened. I'm not sure that it did. It's pretty crazy. So when I was reading through my primary source, which is the IATSE's account of the strike, they're far less corrupt now, and like a few years back, they did a write-up of the whole event. I've been using it as like a blueprint. In that write-up, they claim that following the arrest of the 200 workers at the Technicolor studio, 5 IATSE houses were fucking bombed, which is crazy. Like, that would be like the pivotal moment of the whole strike, would be the houses fucking exploding. But I can't confirm it anywhere. Like, I have been through newspapers from around the time they said it happened, which would be the end of 1946, like November to December. Nothing. I've checked the LA newspapers. Nothing. I've checked the Library of Congress, which is where I get most of my newspapers from. Jack shit there. So there is nothing that says, oh, hey, yeah, these 5 houses got exploded in like winter of 1946. So I can't confirm it happened. However, this would be a whack-ass claim to just make up 75 years later. So who knows? The state of California themselves responded to this violence, which may or may not have involved exploding houses, by initiating one of the biggest mass arrests in California history, arresting over 700 picketers outside the gates of Columbia and a further 1,300 over the next several months. At this point, even the most progressive Hollywood figures were begging Sorrell to stand down, but he refused, at this point set on coming out victorious or running the CSU into the ground trying. On October 24th of 1946, Herb Sorrell met with a group of labor-involved Hollywood figures, including the 3 arbitrators that had ruled in favor of the CSU, and 2 union-friendly actors by the name of Gene Kelly and Ronald Reagan. If you only know Reagan from his presidency, you might go, hey, that's a little weird, but at the time the actor was actually quite pro-union and was even president of the Screen Actors Guild during one of their earliest strikes, in stark contrast to his later activities while in the White House. At the meeting, the group expressed their disapproval with Sorrell, saying that his methods were negatively impacting the CSU and Hollywood as a whole. Reagan had taken quite an oppositional stance to the CSU at the time, and claimed that due to this stance, the CSU had threatened him and his family, an accusation that Sorrell again dismissed as false, while also bringing up the threats of violence that had been made against him by the studios and the mobsters heading the IATSE. However, the meeting ended with a generally upbeat tone that provided a sensible path for the CSU to proceed. The only thing that could go wrong is if some massive GOP landslide in the next month's election exacerbated mass fear and panic regarding the threat of communism and led to a staunch crackdown on union activities and general anti-collectivist sentiment in American culture. Oh, shit. Not even a week later, the other foot dropped. The AFL had reneged on their prior decision, instead ruling that the IATSE had jurisdiction over said erection. As the CSU pointed out, this clarification was a complete 180 from their previous ruling and contained shocking discrepancies from the original clarification. In the early hours of March 3rd, a man was found on the side of the highway around 80 miles from Los Angeles County. The man's hands and feet are bound, and he's been badly beaten. According to the man, the night 3 armed men, one wearing a police badge, had approached him while he was in San Fernando, forcing him into a black sedan. From there, they drove him 30 miles north and east of Bakersfield before beating him and leaving him where he'd be found by police. If you've made it this far into these videos, you should be very aware of who this man is. From what I can find, the men responsible for this were never caught, and this act amounted to nothing more than additional pointless violence designed to dissuade the CSU. So why did the AFL essentially completely change their minds? To explain it, let me first tell you about the Labor Management Relations Act of 1947, better known as the Taft-Hartley Act. So coinciding with these events in Hollywood was a massive wave of strikes across the United States, notably the strike of 43,000 oil workers in October of 1945 and 225 United Auto Workers in November of 1945. The next year, in 1946, over 1.7 million workers would go on strike in a series of strikes primarily consisting of steel, coal, and railroad workers in the Rust Belt. In total, over 4.3 million workers went on strike in 45 and 46. In response to these strikes, Congress would pass a federal law commonly known as the Taft-Hartley Act that restricted the power and abilities of labor unions. It passed the Republican-controlled Congress with a large majority of both the Republican and Democrat vote before being vetoed by Harry Truman. However, Congress would override the veto and the bill would become law in June of 1947. The law, which is still in place to this day, implemented several prohibitions or explicitly gave employers rights that significantly benefited them. Prohibited actions included jurisdictional strikes, wildcat strikes, and mass picketing, as well as preventing unions from donating to federal political campaigns, while also granting employers the right to vocally oppose unions and require anti-union orientations, as well as giving them the right to fire supervisors for pro-union sentiments or generally opposing the views of the business. Additionally, the act banned closed union shops, where to be hired you have to already be part of a union, and permitted states to enact right-to-work laws, which banned unions from requiring employees to join them. The government was also given the power to legally break up a strike if the striking workers were deemed to be vital enough to the economy to the point that the strike could risk a national economic emergency. Which of course would be the entire fucking point of a strike by such workers, but whatever. Although all of these prohibitions and regulations severely impacted the CSU, they were nearly inconsequential compared to the final part of the act, which required unions to file affidavits that stated that the union was not a supporter of the Communist Party and had no intention of overthrowing the US government. The CSU wasn't communist, but the provision would still haunt them. So at this time, Joseph McCarthy was having his enemies within midlife crisis and the US was entering the Second Red Scare, causing many people to point fingers at collectivist movements like labor unions as a prime example of communist subversion. As a result, in the wake of the Taft-Hartley Act, members of unions were viewed with suspicion, and collective bargaining was seen as communist behavior. So with this anti-communist sentiment widespread in both the public and the halls of Congress, Congress made their way to Hollywood due to all of the communism in the air, and held hearings in order to get a better grasp on the labor disputes. Two of the most influential hearings that they held was with Roy Brewer, president of the IATSE, and oh hey, Ronald Reagan. Despite Reagan's previous points of praise for the CSU, once Congress showed up, he was described as appearing confused, seemingly forgetting his meetings with the CSU and their contents. Wouldn't it be a shame if this man became a terrible president and then got dementia and died? On the other hand, Roy Brewer wasn't as subtle. He stood up in front of Congress and said with a straight face that all of the problems within Hollywood's labor disputes were the result of the communists. Due to his testimony and others within the producers in the IATSE, the National Labor Review Board determined that the CSU possessed evidence of communist influence. At this time, I should remind you that the CSU was very anti-communist and actively rejected communist values, but like before, that didn't matter in the slightest. So why was the strike failing? Primarily, it just wasn't affecting the studios to the level you might expect or need for a strike of this size to be effective. Studio profits were higher than ever, and with the IATSE colluding with the producers, CSU just didn't have the bargaining power necessary to accomplish anything meaningful. They just didn't have much they could do. By 1947, the union was falling apart, with large sections of their workforce entirely replaced by new IATSE locals. Fellow union CIO would step in to provide temporary work for the struggling CSU workers, but nothing that CSU could do would get them support from the higher-ups in Hollywood or those in the Hall of Congress, as they were labeled as anti-Americans, headed by a man who they claimed was a member of the Communist Party. At some point, it just all had to end. The end of the lockout came at the tail end of 1948, not with a bang as much as it came with a whimper. The CSU was gone. Some picketers were fined, a few were given jail sentences, but most just returned to work, worse for wear, both physically and materially, than before this whole ordeal. Following the strike, Roy Brewer and Richard Walsh would battle back and forth for control of the IATSE, with Walsh eventually retaining control by the mid-60s. Nowadays, luckily, the IATSE is a far more upstanding union, free of most of its 20th century vices. As for Herb Sorrell, once one of the most prominent figures in U.S. labor, he would die in 1973 in near total obscurity. Not all stories have a happy ending. Sometimes you put every last drop of your blood, sweat, and tears on the table for a cause you deem just, and you still come away with nothing at all.